Today's video is brought to you in part by Frederick's Canvases, who did provide me with the canvas that we're using in today's video. This is a Frederick's watercolor canvas board. These are extremely smooth. It isn't just for watercolor. I use them all the time for acrylics. First thing we're going to do is paint the entire background. Now you'll notice I have not drawn my subject out on the canvas first. The reason for that is acrylics dry very quickly. If I were to draw everything out and try to paint around it, my background's going to be a hot mess because you're going to have brush strokes everywhere where that is not my goal in this piece. You're not going to be able to blend it out as well as you can if you just paint the entire background. So that's what we're going to do. I am using a Taklon bristled filbert to lay in that background, and I want to go with some aqua and gray. Now you can go with any color that you like. You are not limited to the color palette that I am using here. I'm going to start by mixing my gray so that that is ready to go. Let's add some more white to that. Now this is not the water container I normally use when I'm working with acrylics. I just use this one because it fits in my palette, because I wanted you to see how often I add water to my paint. I very rarely am using straight paint. By very rarely, I mean almost never. It's almost always thinned with at least a bit of water. I'm going to need a bit more than that, so let's go ahead and mix that now. Being that it's a background, we will need a decent amount of paint ready to go. So I'm just going to mix that together, and I'm going to start at the bottom here. Make sure you get all the way to the edge. Notice as I make these brush strokes, I go from one side off the canvas and back off the canvas. Don't do a bunch of this. That's not going to get you nice smooth blending. All the way off the canvas. Now I'm going to go ahead and rinse that off. I'm going to start pulling in. I'm going to wipe that on the paper towel. I'm going to go ahead and start pulling in my aqua. You can mix an aqua color with phthalo blue and phthalo green if you have that, but in this case, I already had the color I wanted pre-made, so we'll just go with that. Now the one downside when you're working with a canvas board is there's nothing to grab onto on the sides like you would with a normal stretched canvas. And I'm going to let these two colors just lightly blend together, just a few brush strokes over them. Now don't overdo that. If you keep blending and blending and blending right in this area, you're going to lose your lights and your darks, your like definition between the aqua and the gray. I want to see both colors there, so don't overblend that. If your paint starts to dry, you can use a fine mist sprayer. A regular spray bottle will not work the same, but a fine mist sprayer like this one, and just lightly mist over that. You can keep that paint wet for hours if you needed to. Now I'm going to use a mop brush. This is actually a blush brush. Blush brushes that you find at I get mine usually from TJ Maxx or Ross, some of the more inexpensive stores, discount stores. These work so much better than actual mop brushes because they don't tend to shed like art mop brushes. What I'm doing are little half strokes. Now I often refer to this as blending, but blending really isn't the right word. What I'm doing are little half brush strokes to get rid of my to get rid of brush strokes. Half brush strokes to get rid of brush strokes. That's not redundant at all. But we're just going to go in different directions, and I am barely letting the tip of the bristles touch the canvas so that I can blur this out. I just want a nice soft look. And you don't have to do a color gradient. You could do just one color if you want. And if you have one layer, you do this and you're like, wow, that was really streaky. Mine looks terrible. Do it again. Let it dry and go right back over it. I think I'd like some blotchy white spots in the aqua color. So I'm going to grab some white, and I want to keep this wet. So I'm going to go ahead and do a light mist. And you don't have to you could just do a solid color. If you're really a beginner and you've never painted before, make it easier on yourself. Just pick a solid color. It'll look just fine. I want mine to be not quite that smooth. There we go. Now, if this starts to dry, this won't work. Let's mist that again because mine is starting to dry. And again, little half circles. I'm just barely letting the bristles touch that canvas. Now, if your canvas gets too wet, that will also cause issues. That will cause the paint to start lifting from the canvas. It doesn't really work well. So this technique I'm doing right here, this wetted to wet blending, that does take a little bit of practice. Don't be frustrated if it doesn't look good. I would say give it a try, and if you don't like how it looks, just paint solid over it while you're learning. But at least you had some experience there in trying to get that nice blend. So there is my blotchy background, nothing too fancy. So I'm going to go ahead and rinse my brush. Now when it comes to these mop brushes, we're not using this to dip in the paint and apply to the canvas at all. What we do, these are just used for getting rid of brush strokes. And what I want to do when I rinse this is only rinse the tips. Don't dip the whole thing in water. It takes forever to dry. I only use the tips. There shouldn't be paint on it any more than just the tip of the brush. So we'll just go ahead and rinse that. And then I'm going to take a paper towel. I'm going to rub that in circles to dry that off. And that way it's ready to go if I need it again. We won't on this canvas, but if we did, there we go. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and take a hairdryer to dry this to speed things along. Now this brush here, it's a bit dirty. Wipe that off. I'm just gonna wipe it on a paper towel and then rinse it. I'm done with that brush for now, so let's not ruin that. Make sure you don't leave your brushes full of paint sitting to the side. That is how you ruin stuff. So I'm just going to clean that and then set it flat to the side to dry. Don't leave your brush sitting in water like this. A lot of people will do that to soak it, or I don't know what the goal is there, but you ruin it. You ruin it very quickly. It damages the tips of the brushes, so we don't want to do that. Now, next, you want to draw your subject out on another piece of paper. I'm using a piece of tracing paper. I don't care if you trace the subject from the computer. I don't care if you draw it on another piece of paper and then trace it. Either way, get your subject onto a piece of tracing paper. Technically, you can draw straight on the canvas. The problem with that is you tend to end up with more eraser marks and it gets a little bit messy. So let's simplify things. Draw it on another piece of paper or trace it, whatever you're comfortable with. And we're going to just tape that in the two upper corners so it's not sliding around while we transfer the image. And I'm going to take a piece of transfer paper, and all the supplies I'm using are listed in the video description. And you just need a piece of it. It doesn't have to be the exact size as the subject you're drawing, because you're just going to slide that around. And we're going to take one of these little stylus guys, and I'm just going to trace over my flamingo. And this keeps my lines nice and clean. I don't have eraser marks all over the place. Now, if you do want to draw directly onto the canvas, I recommend getting a white charcoal pencil. There's one by Generals that I really like. And that does usually erase, although I will say there have been a few times I've used it and it didn't erase really well. I had to work to get the paint over it, or to really cover it. Now, why wouldn't you just use a graphite pencil? Because graphite will always show just a bit through these paints. These paints are semi-translucent and they're going to show a little bit. So by using a white charcoal pencil, that's typically, even if it doesn't erase all the way, it's going to mix into the paint, so it's easier to hide. Where the graphite, not so much. If you ever do need to use a graphite pencil with your acrylics, I recommend a water-soluble graphite, not your regular like #2 pencil type. You can see you can kind of see the subject there. It's not super dark, which is good. We don't need it to be too bold. We just want to barely be able to see it. So we'll go ahead and come over here. Okay, so now I need a sort of peach color. And I'm going to use another Taklon bristled filbert. So the peach, I'm going to mix white. I'm going to need some more white on the palette there. I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to orange that up. The red is very overpowering, so I've got to add a decent amount of yellow to make that show up. Get some more red in there. I'm even going to pull some of the magenta or the deep violet. Now this doesn't have to be my final color. This is just a base. Now the bonus of adding the white is very opaque. These three colors here, they're very translucent. If I were to paint just those colors straight onto my greenish background there, or my teal aqua background, then it's not going to show up. It's not going to cover it. In that case, let's say I wanted a yellow flamingo for some reason. I would want to paint in white first and then put the yellow on top, or mix white in with the yellow so that it makes it opaque. Here, this is going to show up just fine. Now see how, I don't know if you can see the little ridges, these little bumps right there. My edge is not clean. That lets me know I need to reload my brush with more paint and more water. Notice I dipped my paintbrush in the water, picked up a little of that before I went onto the paint itself. And this is just going to be a base layer. I don't need the details. I don't need color perfect, nothing like that. You see how the edge, I'm going around that first and keeping it smooth. Again, if it's bumpy, you can see the bumps here. If you get that dry brush look, that's a pretty good symbol to tell everyone that you're very new. You can trick them and let them think you're pretty experienced by using a bit more paint and more water on that brush. It's a very common mistake for somebody who is new to not use very much of either. You're being just way too careful. You don't want to mess up, just a little bit of paint. No, load that sucker up. Let's move this background out of the way. We don't really need that anymore. I don't really care if my brush strokes show a bit. It's not a big deal at this stage. I'm going to use the same thing over here. I'll come back with the highlights later on. So again, I'm getting that dry brush look. Let's add a bit more paint and water so people think we know what we're doing. You'll occasionally see lessons. I've seen a lot of books that push dry brushing as this great technique to learn to paint. It's a technique, but it's also one that it's done very commonly with acrylics, and it normally looks bad. There is a time and a place for dry brushing. I'm not saying it's always bad, but avoid it when you can. It's one of those things that a lot of people do because it's easy, and then they don't have to actually learn how to blend the wet into wet, like what most of what I do is. Now this peach, I'm going to add a little bit of white, but we actually want this in shadow here too, so we're not going to want this part to be totally white. Let's go ahead and fill that in too. That goes all the way down here. And if you're getting that bumpy edge, add more paint and more water to your brush. Like I'm getting right there, so a little bit more water, grab some of that paint, fill that in. A little bit of this lighter color around the eye. Okay. Next, I'm going to go pretty simple here and just paint black for the beak. We'll come back through and add a little bit of highlighting, but not too much. See, you can really see when with the black, see these bumps? This is what we want to avoid. We don't want that dry brush look. It looks terrible. Let's add a bit more water, load that brush again. Now, if you're more comfortable using a small brush, go ahead and switch. You don't have to use a brush this size. The more you paint, the more comfortable you'll get to where you can use pretty much any brush size and make it work for you. But I don't think that you need to try to force yourself to use the same exact size that I'm using. If you like smaller, go for it. I remember watching a teacher years and years ago. He would take people's brushes away and force them to use a big brush. And I mean, yeah, fine, but you're going to learn that all on its own. No reason to make it difficult in the beginning. Gives a little nostril. Okay, I'm going to rinse this out. Now I want to dry this because if I start to paint over this area that's kind of dry but not completely, what will happen is this layer will start to lift up. My background will stay put, but this peach layer will start to lift off the canvas. So let's go ahead and dry that. Okay, next we're going to start adding in our values. We've got some really light areas and some really dark areas, so let's go with that. And I can use this same brush, the same Taklon bristled filbert. I want basically the same color we had here, but way more white. Let's get some more white out on that palette. And the paints that I'm using, these are all the Liquitex Basics. And these are what I use on my advanced paintings too. They're just my favorite paints. They work so well for the way that I paint. I'm not just using them because they're inexpensive. I use them because I really like them. They just work well with my technique. Now, as I do these brush strokes, I'm holding this brush to the side and I'm starting to build up the look of feathers. It doesn't need to be exact, but we do want to make sure it's going in the right direction. Let's get a little bit more water, a little bit more paint here. And we want this highlight going all the way around this back end of the neck. And this is just blocking it in. Nothing needs to look good here. You're going to go through some very ugly stages in the painting. That is totally normal. And you may hit a point where you think, oh my gosh, it looked so good, and then I messed it up with this layer. It wasn't done yet anyway. A bad layer doesn't mean you've ruined anything. It just means you weren't finished. So don't stress yourself out when you hit these ugly stages. Like right now, this is atrocious. It looks like I painted it with my feet. While we're over here with these highlights, let's go ahead and get this back here. This is really overexposed in the reference photo, but I loved that contrast, so we're going to leave ours that way too. And I don't care if this is exact to the photo, close is close enough. But don't just be putting random brush strokes all over. A lot of people will look at the reference photo once and they just start throwing marks everywhere thinking it's going to land and look like feathers. No, that's not really how it looks. You do want to look at that reference photo and go for at least close. And the more you paint, the more you will start to notice. So if you're brand new and you're looking at it going, I don't even see what you're seeing, what are you looking at? The more you paint, you will start to notice more and more. So don't worry about that. It's not something where we all start off noticing all the little details. Get a bit more on that brush. Let's see, we've got a bit of a highlight here on the underside of the beak. Let's go ahead and throw that in while we've got this color out. So I'm really just blocking stuff in. And I keep saying that because I don't want you to freak out thinking, oh my gosh, this is terrible. We've got a few little feathers that stick out over the background. Let's throw those in there. Okay, now I need to get to this more rich color in the shadow. And I don't care if it's exact to my reference photo. That really doesn't matter to me. I'm worried about the values. Are my darks dark enough? My lights light enough? Let's get a little bit of yellow in there. What is on my palette? There we go. I'm going to start putting some of these darks in there. And as I do these brush strokes, I'm just working them. Actually, I'm going to switch brushes. This one is even big for me. I still want a filbert, but I want a smaller one. So by filbert, I mean a brush that has a more rounded tip. You could also use a rake brush for this. This one might be even too small. Let's find out. I'm using a decent amount of water here. Not enough water, not enough paint, not enough anything. Let's reload that. Starting to dry too much. I'm mixing all three of that, the magenta, red, and yellow. Not in love with that. I actually think I'm gonna add a touch of white. You're just gonna experiment. If you notice as I'm doing this, I'm gonna try something, don't like it, try something else. That is what painting is all about. You are constantly gonna be experimenting. No matter how good, how experienced you get, you will always, oh, this is a much better color. You will always be experimenting. It's not a matter of always knowing what to do. And I think that that's something that slows people down. They expect to sit down at the canvas, and if they don't know exactly what to do, they get, worried and they're afraid to mess stuff up. No, you're just experimenting. If something goes wrong, you just paint over it. It's no big deal, especially with acrylics. It's such a forgiving medium. You just paint right on over it if it doesn't look good. Notice how the feathers are moving in this direction here. I'm going to overlap that a bit into that white area, or really pale pink, I should say. It wasn't really white. Those brush strokes are way too long on mine. I need to start shortening those up. There we go. Again, this is just blocking it in. This is a very ugly stage, and that's okay. Got a big shadow in here. Don't feel like you need to blend everything out. Let those brush strokes show. They work like feathers. You just want to make sure the brush strokes are going in the right direction for the feathers. See how it starts to move back this way? Now, right now, I've got basically two solid colors. We're going to come back through with some more peach tones too. We're not leaving it like this. So if you're sitting there going, well, mine should have more peach, don't worry about it. We're going to come back and do that. Don't try to do it just yet. We'll make it more simplified. Get some shadows in here. Again, they don't need to be exact. We want to get the hint of some of those shadows in the feathers though. Now, as you get into the shadows, one of the things that a lot of people think is, oh, it's a shadow, it should be black, just add black. No, not that, well, sometimes I guess. But in the case like this, where you're using these pinks and we're gonna be doing oranges, you start adding black and you make a horrible color. If I'm using reds and oranges, yellows, I rarely, sometimes with reds, but almost never with oranges or yellows. Don't jump straight to black. Try purples and magentas instead for a lot of those shadows. We've got some pink in here too, so let's go ahead and add that in. Again, I'm adding water to that brush. I don't want a dry brush. I'm not looking for that bumpy look that's really rough. Okay, let's start getting some of these orange peach tones in there. And I can use the same color I'm using. I'm just going to add some yellow to it. And some white. And if you mix a color and you make a brush stroke and you're like, oh crap, that looks terrible, don't worry about it. Adjust it. This isn't something where you have to be right first time through. I'm probably not going to like the color I try right now, but it lets me know, what do I need to change? Yep, that needs to be way lighter. So let's take a lot more white. Get a bit more magenta in there too. It's a little too yellowy for my taste. Let's see where we're at now. Closer. I think I could use more white though. Let's try that. And there we go. I like this one much better. Now, if you want your brush strokes to be more smooth, you can take this fine mist sprayer. Again, a normal spray bottle doesn't work the same. This gives you a fine mist. I can lightly go over this. And when I make these brush strokes now, they're going to come out looking like I'm blending wet into wet, almost like an oil painting. It gives you a really pretty soft look. If yours are more rough, don't worry about it. If you're just starting out, it's not a huge deal, but it's a little tip that can make it look a little nicer there. See how I'm just following the direction of those feathers. This is really going in between my dark and my light. It gives me a nice transition between those two. When you paint, it's all about layering. This isn't a paint by number, just put the right color in the right place. Like right there, it's too light. That's okay, I'm gonna come back and layer darker areas. You're gonna layer until it looks good. If you're just trying to make one layer look perfect, it's a paint by number. We're fancier than that. We're going to keep layering and layering and layering, and you are going to absolutely hate some of your layers. It's okay. And I know I'm stressing a lot the whole concept of having bad layers, but it is something that I see so many new artists discouraged by. You're going to have these, and it's totally normal, and it doesn't mean your end painting can't be good as long as you layer until it looks good. I've actually got merch in my merch shop, that's not how you speak, merch shop that has the layer till it looks good. So, if you need a reminder, that's there. But see how this blends so soft because I lightly misted it. I'm gonna lightly mist again, and I mean light, don't soak this, just lightly over the face there. Now you might be thinking, well, what happens? I mixed a color and I ran out. How do I mix the exact same color? One, you're just going to use this, you've got a limited color palette. It's from those colors. It's going to be similar. As long as it's close enough. You don't need to be mixing exact colors. That was something that I got hung up on when I was a new artist. I mean, part of me, I'm kind of glad because I did learn to mix colors really well because I kept being determined that everything had to be exact. But the reality is it's not that big of a deal. No one is going to notice if your next color isn't exact. Close is good enough. See these little feathers. See how I'm doing tiny little brush strokes in here? So I've got the little feathers. Let me know in the comments, what type of beginner lesson would you like me to paint next? It'll be in acrylics, but I need to know what subject you guys want to see. Okay, let's get some of this color. It's really nice. I want to get that more in the beak here. That highlight. There's a fungus gnat for my plants flying by. I'm going to get a little bit of a highlight on that beak. I'm just going to follow that through. Okay. I'm going to pull some of that gray that we used in the background because some of that is still wet. I want to use that. You can see we've got a bit more of a shadow right in here. Let's use that right in through here. Okay. Now I'm going to switch to a smaller brush. I need to start getting some of the detail around the eyes. Actually, I take that back. Let's finish the feathers first. I'm jumping all over the place. Let's dry this. And I'm going to grab a liner brush, if I can find one. This one is a #1 synthetic hog-haired liner brush. Look how long the bristles are. Longer is even better. You don't want to get brushes thinking that you're going to get detail with something like this. If you can look here, look how little those bristles are. A lot of people will think, I don't think that wants to come in focus. There we go. A lot of people think smaller brush means finer detail. No, you want longer bristles. This is going to get you finer detail, even though the brush is bigger. So the way that we do this, and I have a video showing how to use a liner brush. I'll put a link if you want to follow that. But we want to use this, focus on the paint being up here, not back here. That'll help keep the brush healthy longer. And you want to thin it out. You don't want thick, chunky paint on that. There's a decent amount of water. Whoops, as it falls. So we're just going to go right around that eye. He's got his upper eyelid. And while I've got this brush out, let's get some of those brighter highlights. A little bit more on that beak. I need to pull some more black in there. See how I thin that with water? We don't want a lot. Or we don't want a lot of thick paint, I should say. Let's see, this comes back further. So let's go here. Define that a bit more. Now their beaks have some ridges on it, and you can't really see it in the reference photo, but I painted enough flamingos to know it will look better if I go ahead and add some. I'm going to go a little bit darker than what my highlights were, but I just want some color in there so it looks like the light is catching it. See how things are starting to slowly come together and they don't look so scary anymore? Now I want to paint yellow inside the eye. Two things. One, if I paint straight yellow over that aqua green, although the aqua green eye looks kind of cute, but if I paint yellow over that, it's not going to show up as yellow because the yellow is too translucent. So I have to add white to it to make it more opaque, and that's going to make it more of a pastel color, which works for this painting. But let's say, what if I wanted just a bright, bold yellow, paint it white, let it dry, and then paint yellow on top. So I'm going to use that same liner brush, and I'm going to mix some white. Pull a little bit of yellow in there, a little bit more. And a little bit more. I think I want a little bit of that red in there too. Or let's go with magenta just to tone it down a little bit. I say magenta, what it is the deep violet. Actually, I think that's the color I used. Yeah, that's deep violet. So deep violet being closer to purple, that's going to neutralize that yellow so it's not too like, wow, that's a sunflower. Actually, this is kind of a sunflower yellow, so that's not the best example. I'm just going to fill that in. Now notice right now it's very bland. I need to come back through and get my shadows around it still. So I'm going to rinse that brush out. And for my shadows, I'm not going to jump to black. We do have black in the center of the eye, but remember, we don't want to just jump to black every time we've got a shadow. And especially in this case, I'm right around the yellow. Black, if that mixes in with it, I'm going to end up with this ugly green. Let's do this. And we'll go right around the eyelid. And we've got more shading we can start doing around the feathers here. Now that eye looks really weird. Let's go ahead and put the pupil in now because I don't know about you, but he's starting to weird me out. He looks kind of like a zombie flamingo right now. So we've got the little dot in here. There we go. Now I can use a little bit of black, not much. Don't go crazy with the black there. Okay, so what do we need next? We need some highlights. We need some orange. So with the Liquitex Basics, their orange is extremely translucent, but it is good for glazing. So I don't use it if I want something to be really bright, bold orange. I normally mix that, like if I need a more opaque color, I mix that with my red and my yellow. But in this case, we're gonna be glazing. I'm gonna go ahead and get this is cadmium orange hue. We'll put a little bit of that out. And so this is their oranges are very weird with the Liquitex. They're very almost gooey and they're very translucent. But when you're glazing, they're amazing because glaze we're thinning the paint with water. We want a translucent layer. We're tinting the color. So now let's take some of that orange. Look at that. Look how it just glows. It looks so pretty. And I'm following the direction of the feather still. See how I'm making those brush strokes so it looks like it goes in. Get some in here in the face. What a difference that makes in the color. Like he looks like he glows. We've got a decent amount here. Now, if you don't have orange, I don't always buy it. I don't even know if I've got it on my supply list of must-have colors. Just mix it with your red and your yellow, and you're gonna mix more water with yours. And even here, I am still mixing water, but I don't need to mix as much as I would just because it's already so translucent on its own. Let's pull a little bit of orange in the beak here. Got a decent amount up here. Whoops, just wipe that off where I went out of the line there because, you know, I'm a pro. Okay. Let's start getting our values a little bit darker. So this is our stage. We've got everything blocked in. We see where things go. Now we really want to focus on get those darks a bit darker, your lights lighter. This is where we're focusing on our values. So here's a really cool thing about painting. You can have kind of crappy technique. You're new, you don't know what you're doing, or maybe you're just sloppy. It can be kind of crappy. That's okay. If your values are good, your darks are really dark, your lights are really light, your painting can still look absolutely amazing and people will love it. Your values matter so much more than most things. Another thing is a lot of people get hung up on making sure that they mix the perfect color. The color's not that big of a deal. Are your lights light enough? Your darks dark enough? One thing that people will often ask me, let's say I'm painting a tiger. Well, I need to know exactly what color you're using. No, you don't. You don't need to use the same colors. Yours can look just as realistic. I'm using more magenta here, by the way. Yours can look just as realistic if your values are correct. You could paint your tiger in purples and he'll look realistic. If your values are correct, he'll just look like he's under a purple light. Don't let yourself get in this just absolute hang up of, I've got to study color. I need to know every color I'm mixing. It's just not that big of a deal. I mean, you can study color if you want, but I would wait until you're a little bit more advanced. It'll make more sense to you. When you're new, get your darks dark enough, your lights light enough, and you're good. I don't want to completely cover my orange, and I'm still making my brush strokes move the direction of the feathers. Get some more magenta, more yellow, more red. We'll make our darker color here. I want to get it pretty dark just for the deeper shadows. Actually, I should stop being lazy. Let's rinse that brush and switch to a smaller brush, which is a bit more appropriately sized, the one we used earlier. Still a tack bristle. Actually, this one is a synthetic hog-haired filbert. Close enough. A tack bristle will work just fine. We've got those nice deep shadows here. This is a combination where I've mixed a lot of the red, the magenta. Just make it dark. It doesn't have to be exact in the color. making these look like feathers. See how I'm pulling that up into the feather? We'll get darker shadows in here now. Now notice all the layers, how I built up to get my highlights and my shadows. It makes it much easier when you build like this than trying to do paint by number and just put the right color in the right place. That can be very, very frustrating. And it doesn't typically look as good. Normally, the more layers that you paint, the more realistic your work ends up looking. Because each of these layers are semi-translucent. The way that the light reflects, that's not a word, refracts through it, it gives you a lot more depth in your work. So you can see how I'm using these little brush strokes, so it's kind of like feathers. Oops, a little too much. Let's dab that with my finger. I got a little too many feathers in there. Now be careful, if you overdo the amount of brush strokes in here, I mean, you can paint over it, it's not the end of the world, but you can make him look really frumpy. Get some of these streaks here in the beak. Now notice, one of the things that a lot of people will look at, they'll see this and know that that part of the beak should be white. Yeah, but white usually isn't white. White is toned down, it reflects other colors. It's gonna pick up everything around it. So in this case, we've got the peach, we've got magentas, we've got all of the colors in the flamingo are reflecting on that beak. Putting a few more marks in here for those feathers there. Now I'm going to come through with more highlights. I'm going to rinse that brush off. I'm going to hit my camera there. Let's grab some white. I really want this to be a lot brighter. I want a few of these feathers sticking out over the edge. Don't go too crazy. We don't want them that frumpy. Now this white, because I've thinned it with water, it's a little bit more translucent, so I'm still seeing some of that pink underneath or showing through, and that's good. Let's get some more highlights on some of these, just a little bit. That brush is starting to get dry, so I need to load more water and more paint on it. Now notice I've changed directions of that brush, so it's going the directions the feathers would. It starts to turn downward here. So if I've got brush strokes, it just looks like feathers. And then I'm going to put a few more little teeny highlights. I'm going to hold the brush to the side. You can use your liner brush for this. But I'm going to give it a little bit of a highlight there. A little bit over his eyelid there. Now you can leave it like this, or if you want to go with a more stylized look, and the more stylized look can sometimes hide mistakes if things just weren't, you looked at it and you're like, it's all right. One of the things that you can do, and this isn't something that makes it look more realistic, but it does give it a cool feel. Take another brush, and I'm going to add some black. I'm going to line parts of this guy. So you start getting into almost more of a pop art style, but it still looks cool, especially in this case because of his black beak. So I'm going to go, I need more water. That is way too dry. And I'm not trying to make one thin line. I want a nice, big, bold line here. There we go. There is our finished painting, and it just gives it a cool look. It makes it stand out a lot more. You can, if you want, you can throw a few in with the feathers. I don't want to go too crazy there. If you do this, really, it's a less is more thing. I do feel like I could put a little bit more around his eye, though. One last thing I want to do to touch him up. I'm going to take a little bit of that black. I feel like I could make this stand out a bit more. Again, this is not something that's making it look more realistic. It just gives it a cool, stylized feel. And especially when you're first learning to use these brushes, if things are kind of like messy, not going right, sometimes this can almost hide some of those mistakes. There we go. Now I want to show you a trick on signing your name. One of the things that will often happen is well, you try to write it with a liner brush and it doesn't come out looking like your signature. So what we're going to do is take a white charcoal pencil. Now this is what I was talking about earlier, where if you wanted to draw directly on the canvas, this is what I would use. This white charcoal pencil by Generals. There we go. So what I'm going to do, I want to figure out, do I want my name here? No, that's a little weird in his face. I'm going to sign it over here. Actually, before we do that, I should dry it. I'm going to write my name like I normally would. Now, all I have to do is trace over that. So I was able to write it, moving it normal. What happens if you try to write your name with a liner brush, if it doesn't turn? So watch what I do here. I'm going to use black paint since I use black all over the place. Whenever I sign my name, I want to use the same colors that I use somewhere else in the painting. But watch how I will do one loop, stop, lift the brush. Another one, stop, lift the brush. If you try to do this in one movement, it ends up very messy. The brush skips. But here, I'm just tracing over what I wrote. And now my name looks just like it would if I wrote it with a pen or a pencil. Now you will get to the point where you can write with a brush without having to use that little trick, but it can help you to make your signature look more accurate from the beginning. If you followed along with me on this, congratulations. That is so awesome. You just completed a painting. It doesn't matter if it came out good or not. You just created something that did not previously exist, and that is something to be proud of. Plus, you're taking another step forward in whatever your goals are as an artist. I want to help you to take it even farther than that. Head over to Patreon, where for as little as $4 a month, you get access to 7 years of my slower lessons. So that's a lot. That's over 300 lessons I've got available for you right now that are going to help you improve your own skills. Have you subscribed yet? If not, I have a handy button right there. It's round, has an orange arrow going towards it. If you click on that, that will help YouTube to maybe notify you when new videos go up. Also, click the bell notification icon to be more likely to be notified. And you can sign up to my email newsletter. I send out a newsletter once a week letting you know whatever new paintings I had go up, along with some art motivation and other fun stuff.